London had become a noisy and polluted city of industry and invention. The disparity between the upper and lower classes had grown significantly, and the situation for children living in poverty was particularly bleak. Many ended up working long hours in factories or workhouses, or turning to professional begging and thievery. Due to rampant sickness and hunger, some children died in those environments.
When you think of orphanages, you might think Oliver Twist or children sleeping in cold, dark rooms. But the truth is that orphanages were originally built out of compassion to take care of children in need. They were often the only place a child could go from the safety of the dangerous streets that they called home. For many centuries, there have been people and organizations that have specialized in the care of orphans. But it wasn't until the 18th century that the world would begin to see the overwhelming need to establish an institution of orphan care. One of the first orphanages was born in the heart of a sea captain who gave away an enormous fortune to see it become a reality.
Thomas Coram was born in Dorset, England in 1668. He was very fond of his parents, whom he spoke of highly. However, at a very young age, his mother passed away. His father, who was believed to be a master mariner, traveled often, and when young Coram was 11, his father helped him get a job at sea. Due to his early apprenticeship, young Coram never received a proper education. This lack of a formal education would later become a catalyst for his philanthropic endeavors throughout his later life. In the early 1690s, a London merchant hired Coram to voyage to colonial America and oversee the supply of cheap merchant ships for the growing cross-Atlantic trade. After working for the London merchant for several years, Coram moved to Taunton, Massachusetts, which had been founded by members of the Plymouth colony, to establish his own shipyard. There, he married the love of his life, Eunice Waite.
Though Coram was considered to have the typical rough edges of a sea captain, he was also known as a man of conviction and compassion. Coram was an advocate of fairness and equality. He felt that all people were created equal and were meant to take care of their fellow man. It was well known that the couple aided and promoted the rights of Native Americans with whom they lived and worked.
At one time, when two Mohicans went to London to apply to the king for redress after their people had been defrauded of their land, Coram took up their case and argued fiercely for them. Coram also went against the culture of the time in his advocacy for the education of girls, whether Native American or British. He believed they should have the same rights as any boy, and he would continue to champion this belief throughout his life in numerous ways. In December 1703, he gave 59 acres of land in Taunton to the Anglican Episcopal Church to be used for a church and schoolhouse established by Britain. However, many of Coram's neighbors did not welcome his loyalty to the British crown, nor his Anglican faith. Religious and political differences soon surfaced.
In 1704, at the age of 36, Coram and his wife returned to London. There he would continue to try to shape the new colonies to have the ideals and principles he wished to see in his own home of England, those of faith, equality, and second chances.
He suggested a colony be founded in South Carolina specifically for the poor, for those who needed a fresh start. He worked with James Oglethorpe, social and prison reformer, on this proposition, who eventually founded the colony of Georgia. Thomas Coram's knowledge and experience in the new colonies were invaluable. Coram worked hard to make the new settlement, Georgia, a success. He raised funds and attended meetings regularly as plans were made. His biggest points of disagreement were over the idea of allowing slavery in the colony. Coram was a big opponent of slavery and their refusal to allow women equal rights of inheritance in the new colony. He believed this to be unfair and a deterrent for families. Coram won both battles, and of the latter, it was written that Captain Coram, who was violent for female succession, was much pleased with the intended act. Unfortunately, as the colony began to be run by others, things shifted from Coram's original ideals.
Soon, Thomas Coram turned his attention toward the work needed to be done on his own doorstep. He and his young wife, Eunice, were unable to have children, and so began to invest in work that was dear for both of them, focusing on care and education of children in need.
Though booming economically in the late 18th century, London had become a noisy and polluted city of industry and invention. The disparity between the upper and lower classes had grown significantly, and the situation for children living in poverty was particularly bleak. Many ended up working long hours in factories or workhouses, or turning to professional begging and thievery. Due to rampant sickness and hunger, some children died in those environments. After Coram and his wife had returned to England, they had become increasingly alarmed at the amount of unloved, destitute, and dying children on London's streets. They felt that something must be done, and they could be the ones to do it. Coram decided to petition the king for a charter to build a foundling hospital supported by patrons to protect these children. But this proved difficult. It seemed impossible to gain the backing of anyone influential enough. In 18th century England, there was a strong stigma towards children born illegitimately, and a belief that supporting vagrant parents who did not have the ability or desire to raise their own children would only perpetuate the problem.
However, Coram was determined to fight for a place for these children on the street. For 17 years, Coram and his wife worked to find a way to make it happen. Since the idea was rejected by the British male aristocracy, Coram turned to the leading men's spouses instead.
His first target was the young Duchess of Somerset, who was married to Charles Seymour, the richest man in England. Her husband had already refused Coram's idea for the orphanage, so supporting such a cause would be going against her husband in a somewhat public way. However, moved by Coram's plea for the plight of these children and the action needed to be taken to relieve them of their suffering, the Duchess graciously signed the petition. This started a domino effect, and over time, 20 other duchesses, baronesses, and countesses followed her example, convincing their husbands to do the same. At a later court, accolades were given to Coram, who requested that thanks be given to the ladies of quality and distinction who had been willing to step up for the children.
The first stone of the foundation of the Foundling Hospital, England's first home for children, was laid on September 16th, this month in history, in 1742. Thomas Coram's idea for his charitable institution that would take in unwanted children and give them the care and education they needed had finally become a reality. It would be called Foundling Hospital, a place of hospitality and healing. All of the children brought into the home were given entirely new identities. Wherever they had come from or whatever they had been through could all be left behind. This was an opportunity for them to have a fresh start on life.
The home provided shelter, food, clothing, medical care, and education for both boys and girls, as Coram insisted, but it also involved much of the London community. Instrumental in the support of Coram's dream were several artists, the most famous, English painter William Hogarth and the composer George Friedrich Handel. With their help, the public was made more aware of the charity and garnered even further support in the community. Like the Corams, Hogarth and his wife were also childless. Hogarth became one of the founding governors, along with designing the school's coat of arms and fostering a number of the children in their own home. Hogarth also came up with the idea to set up a permanent art exhibition at the Institute, encouraging other leading artists of the day to donate art pieces as well, which not only brought attention to the charity, but unknowingly at the time, established the UK's first public art gallery. Handel donated an organ and conducted annual benefit concerts of Messiah and a specially composed choral piece, the Foundling Hospital Anthem, in the hospital's chapel to help raise needed funds. Their combined efforts paved the way for creative arts supporting philanthropy today. From the benefactors and artists who helped financially support the Institute, to the wet nurses and clergy who took care of the infants, to the families who took in the children as apprentices, many in the community became involved in the mission of Foundling Hospital.
Year by year, the orphanage began to grow as children were brought to its doors, most as infants. Between January 1750 and December 1755, 783 children were taken in. And by 1763, so many children had been brought to the home that eventually admission required applicants to provide their name and circumstances, rather than just being able to anonymously drop off a child. Though the organization wasn't perfect and some issues arose, Coram tried to set up checks and balances to keep an eye on the logistics of the organization and the treatment of the children.
In fact, Charles Dickens' novel Oliver Twist, which portrays the plight of the orphan and orphan care at that time, gave a kind nod to Foundling Hospital. The orphanage was very close to Doughty Street, where Dickens and his family were living while he was finishing Oliver Twist. On Sundays, Dickens used to worship in the Foundling Chapel with his family. In Dickens' novel, he writes of a compassionate and important character who saves Oliver from prison and the book's villains, Mr. Brownlow, the same name of Foundling Hospital's secretary, Mr. Brownlow, a man who is an orphan himself, grew up at Foundling Hospital and went on to work at the charity for 58 years. The charity was eventually taken over and led by others, but throughout Thomas Coram's life, he continued his work of children's rights, education, and women's equality. When the ship captain passed away on March 29, 1751, at the age of 83, he was buried in the chapel of the Foundling Hospital. Years later, a statue was erected in his honor with an inscription calling him a pioneer in child welfare.
At Thomas Coram's passing, there would still be much work to do in the continual reformation of child labor and orphan care. However, Coram had done more than anyone to bring awareness to the plight of unwanted children. In the early 1900s, due to the industrial boom, almost half of the factory workforce were younger than 20. In rural areas, children as young as 5 or 6 worked in fields away from their homes.
Thomas Coram and his wife had a vision to love the unloved and take action where many had turned a blind eye. Because of this, from 1741, when the first babies were admitted, to 1954, when the last student was placed in foster care, the Foundling Hospital cared for and educated nearly 25,000 children. The Thomas Coram Foundation for Children still works with children and young people across the UK and beyond today. At the turn of the century and throughout the 1900s, laws and regulations that protected and provided for orphans and child welfare can be attributed to the legacy of Thomas Coram.
James 1:27. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to constantly work alongside and for orphans and widows in their affliction, despite any costs.